This is Book Public from Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. It's September, and that means the latest edition of the O. Henry Prize-winning Best Short Stories collection is here. This is an anthology treasured by story writers and story fans. Year after year, for almost 105 years, it has represented a rightful celebration of this genre. The O. Henry Prize is the oldest major prize in short fiction in America. Writers from any place in the world at any point in their writing careers are eligible. This year's edition includes stories by Kate DiCamillo and Dave Eggers, but also authors on the rise like Allegra Hyde. This edition also includes stories in translation. I spoke to Jenny Minton Quigley, editor of the O. Henry Best Short Story series, and Amor Towles, the guest editor for this 2024 edition in the series. This is such a venerable series. Now is it 105 years in its 105th year? Jenny, can you tell us about the O. Henry Prize series?
I think it's the 104th year, although I'm not sure, but they took 1 year off before I came on board. But it was started in 1919. William Sidney Porter, whose pen name was O. Henry, his friends came together after his death and wanted to honor him. He is the writer of, most famously, The Gift of the Magi. He was quite a character. He wrote stories every Saturday in the Saturday Evening Post. After he died, his friends came together and in his honor wanted to create a prize, which they called the O. Henry Prize. Blanche Colton Williams was the first series editor of it, and it's been going since.
That's incredible. And how long have you been with the series?
This is my 4th year.
Wow, that's wonderful. What's it meant to you to have Amor Towles as a guest judge for the 2024 edition?
Oh, it's phenomenal. Amor, I think I wrote to you for 2 years.
Well, yeah, we had to work our calendars out, but yeah, no, I think any writer in America is very flattered to be asked to judge the prize because of both its revered history and the extraordinary group of stories that have come over the course of that time. The large group of great American writers who've been received the award over time. So it's a trust, in a way. You're being asked to step in and take control of for a minute, but so it's very flattering to be asked.
What are some of the trends, Jenny, that you've seen in these 4 years that you think are notable for story lovers?
I guess the first thing I would say is that when they came together, this was to celebrate the art of the short story and to strengthen writing by publishing the best stories that then younger writers could read and learn from. One thing, just before quickly I answer your question, like recently I've been flipping back and can't believe is that how many famous writers were discovered. That feeling of discovery where a lot of writers, I think, Amor, in the preface to your table for two or in the letter to the booksellers, you said that you started out writing short stories.
Yeah, which I think, a very common experience for many writers.
Right. I think a lot of writers sink their teeth into it. And so, just recently, like in 1929, Dorothy Parker, in 1939, William Faulkner won first prize. At that point, they still gave first, second, and third prize, which is something we very recently did away with because we thought it sort of diminished the other 17 O. Henry Prize winners. But in 1939, he won first prize for a story that was in Harper's Magazine, and Amor just this year selected a story by Madeline Fitch from Harper's Magazine. So there's some things that are continuous. I mean, when you look at it, it's like Eudora Welty in the 40s, Truman Capote in the 40s, Flannery O'Connor in the 50s, Tilly Olsen and John Updike at the beginning of the 60s, Joyce Carol Oates came in the 70s, Raymond Carver, Alice Walker, Stephen King, Alice Munro, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Jhumpa Lahiri, so many of these writers. And so when we're publishing their short stories, one trend I found is that in the 4 years is that the guest editor and I will love a story and the guest editor will select it and it will seem to be written by an unknown writer. And, 2 years later, everybody knows that writer, which is a very fun part of it.
That is so incredible. Well, maybe can we talk about the yeoman's work of literary journals? You mentioned Harper's, but this collection includes stories that originally were published in a variety of these, not just Harper's or the New Yorker, but also smaller journals like Story and Gulf Coast. So can you talk a little bit, Jenny, about that?
I would love to. What's interesting about that is so many of the stories are published in journals. There's hundreds and hundreds of them. We list them in the back of the book, a directory for aspiring writers who want to submit their fiction, but so many are coming out of universities. And, because they have smallish print runs and they're expensive to print, the financial models aren't that great. But Amor chose stories from the Harvard Review and trying to think of, I can open it up, but there's the Kenyon Review, which is phenomenal, and Michigan Quarterly. And some of them, the Gettysburg Review just closed, was shut down, and it was shut down because this financial model is difficult. But I think that an argument should be made that these journals from universities give internships to their students. And so in the humanities, when people are discussing what is the value of an English degree, right? An English major, which now my son is, and we're starting to worry, what's he going to work in? Well, book publishing, right?
Mhm.
And those book publishers look at resumes that have internships. And most of these journals that are just amazing coming out of the universities they'll have one staff member or possibly two, and then they're run by students.
Yeah. Or volunteers, right? Small armies of volunteers. It's incredible. Amor, I love short stories, and I think I'd rather read story collections and anthologies more than almost anything else. But very often, I don't know if you get this too, I hear people say that, that they'd rather read a novel, and they compare the two genres, the novel, the short story, as if apples and oranges were the same thing. But they're very different. A short story isn't like a novel light or something. So would you share with us what it is about the short story that you love? And I know you're a novelist too, but what is it about the short story for you?
I talk about some of this in the introduction to the collection, but so I'm going to repeat myself to some degree. But I think the novel as an art form for writers, consciously or unconsciously, has to be very focused on orientation. That in the course of the first 50 pages, you're laying out where this is taking place, who it's taking, who the main figures are, when it's taking place, what are the recent events that are informing the sort of emotional tension among the characters, some foreshadowing of where things may be going. There's all this orientation to allow the reader to sort of begin with a sense of a foundation of where they are, so they can then go through the evolution that's a natural part of experiencing the narrative of a novel as the characters change and face circumstances and et cetera. A short story has none of that. In a great way, I've really come to think of it as a short story is a little bit like when you come into a restaurant and you sit down and there's a couple at the table next to you, and they're in a serious conversation, a heated conversation, so much so that they're not even lowering their voices anymore. They're just speaking openly, so you can't help but overhear them. And as you're listening, you sort of think, man, how old is she? And what did he do last night? And are they married? And who's Tony? You're all these questions to present themselves as you listen to them argue. And just as you start beginning to piece it together, they pay their check and they leave. And you want to kind of run outside the restaurant and follow them into the street. I've got questions for you too. But that's the nature of a short story, is it kind of drops you into a moment where you're not, a whole world isn't constructed for you carefully, to help you sort of build it piece by piece. Instead, you have to sort of figure it out as quickly as you can, what's going on and who these people are. And just as it begins to crystallize for you, it's over, and the story does not then go on to tell you necessarily all the things that come out of this tense moment or this interaction or this chance event or what have you. You have to imagine what the impact of this is on the lives of the people that you've just met, for the first time. And I think that difference can make the short story very liberating, both for the writer and for the reader. I think it is a different experience. And I'll just say another thing that I think is different is the nature of a short story is that allows a writer to tune up some aspects of the writing, which they probably couldn't do over the course of a full novel. So in other words, if you had a really cynical, witty narrator, that over 400 pages might start to wear on you, but in a 14-page story, the more cynical and witty they are, the better. You know what I mean? So you can take kind of the brevity of it and take advantage of it to investigate a particular tone of voice, a particular approach to storytelling, particular approach to imagery that is fresh and alive, but somehow is less likely to be something that the writer or reader would want to have play out over 400 pages.
Yeah, and I have had a sense lately that maybe short stories are, I don't know, they're having a moment or something. Have you all seen this in the zeitgeist? And everyone should run out and read Table for Two, by the way, by Amor Towles. I'm thinking about that couple in the restaurant and at a table for two. But
Yeah, right.
but have you all had this sense that maybe is the short story having a moment right now?
Well, Jenny knows better than me, but if it's having a moment, it's a sixth moment in 100 years kind of thing, where every 20 years it has another moment, or where suddenly Carver is there and the story gets, embraced all over again after Updike or whatever, whoever pick your character. And you're nice to mention the Table for Two, the collection that I just had come out this year. And I gotta say, one of the most consistent pieces of feedback I'll get from my own fans who contact me, through email or what have you, is, I picked up your book with dread. I never buy short stories, but because it was you, or because I liked a Gentleman in Moscow, or whatever the reason, or my sister gave it to me. So and then it's this description of how satisfied they were with the experience of reading it.
Yeah.
And I'm not just saying that to blow my horn. I do think it's my window, I think, on the bigger picture, which is that we know statistically that the short story collection does not sell anywhere near what the novel will sell typically, and that's obviously a generalization, but that the appetite for the American reader tilts firmly towards the novel, away from the short story. But it's not because of having carefully read all these stories and weighed the two different forms and decided, yeah, this one's for me and that one's not. I think it's more kind of a habit, I think. And when people then delve into well-written short stories, I think they're always surprised at how satisfying they can be as an art form. And of course, one of the great ironies of this is that it kind of should be the opposite when you think about the investment of time, right? It takes us only an afternoon, to go in a short story from beginning to end, or not even an afternoon. Whereas for a novel, that's a real commitment. And but despite that, that the willingness to sample a short story is not as strong as it should be, given what the experience is of readers once they've finished the stories. You know what I mean? Which I think tends to be a very favorable experience.
You mentioned your introduction for this collection, and I was thinking about how it put me in the mind a little bit of Frank O'Connor's seminal work, The Lonely Voice, seminal work about the short story. And he writes about submerged populations. The short stories are about submerged populations. And by that, he really means outsiders, outliers, people who don't belong. The short story democratized literature, he said. And I think about how that on its own should be a very appealing part of the short story. And then we would argue, well, poetry does that. Novels do that. Plays do that. Sure. But there's something about the short story in that sort of the economy of that space where, as you say, there are certain things that you can craft, or certain things that you can do with the element of a story, one or another element. And there's just nothing quite like it. But the thing about the short story for me very often is what you said, Amor, about wanting to run after the couple to have them answer some questions. And this is the battle with my students too, is when they say, they come to the end of the story and they turn the page and they say, that's it, that's the ending. And they find it very unsatisfying sometimes until they do a little bit more reading. And I say to them, but that's it. It's the mystery of what you can't know will come next, is the mystery of people, is the mystery of these submerged populations, that we all experience loss as human beings. And this is reflected back to us in the short story. It's a tough sell sometimes with them, and they're like, they want a different kind of ending sometimes. Besides that, as I'm thinking about Frank O'Connor and what he wrote, is what I so appreciate about this collection, the diversity of the stories, the diversity of the voices here, but also I appreciate so much that you include stories in translation in this collection. I think sometimes we don't celebrate literary translation enough. And I wonder what you can say, Jenny, about what you think about the ways that translation extends our reading lives. And it does much more than that, right? But what do you think about literary translation and what it can do for us?
Okay, well, my head is swirling from everything
Oh,
Amor just.
sorry.
No, I would where I would sort of jump into what he was saying, or what you asked before, is that when O. Henry published his stories in the Saturday Evening Post, I think arguably thousands and thousands of people read them. I think in a way they were even more accessible then than now. And what Amor was saying about how every 20 years, I would say it's even every 10 years, or there on the National Book Award list, there will be a couple of short story collections. What's occurred to me, not just with your podcast, Yvette, but now in the last couple of years, our O. Henry collection, since we frankly added guest editors, have gotten so much more popular, and we have added now an audiobook. And short stories are so conducive, I think, to listening to during a ride in the car, right? It's almost like a podcast, whereas you go for your drive, you're listening to the novel, first chapter, you sort of come back in, do you have to go back? I think the audio books really will help the short stories appeal. And then as far as translations go, it's one of the ways we wanted to differentiate ourselves from the best American short stories. It's one of the ways when we were thinking about O. Henry and how he was such an everyman, and he wrote about the everyman before his time. And in 1900 he published a book called The 4,000,000, which was in response to Mrs. Astor and her best friend Ward McAllister, who built Mrs. Astor had a ballroom that could fit in New York, could fit 400 people. And that was all that she and Ward McAllister deemed were the amount of people that were worth getting to know. So he wrote a book called The 4,000,000. And when you expand on that, if we don't read stories that are translated, we're not really learning about people from other countries, from other backgrounds, not in the same way as if we're just limiting ourselves to people who speak and write in English. So Amor selected two stories for the best short stories from translation. The Soccer Balls of Mr. Kurz, that is translated from the Italian by Michel Mari. And then this beautiful story, and that one was in the New Yorker, which continues every week to publish terrific short stories. And then My Good Friend, which is translated from the Portuguese by Julian Light and translated by Zoe Perry in the Paris Review. And I would argue, I'd be interested in what Amor thinks, but I would argue those two stories have a different tone than the rest of the book. They just take you into a different world.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, what do I think about that? If you think about over time, or we go back to the early part of the 20th century, and we were O. Henry, and where the short story was extremely popular, as you point out, and where it's how Fitzgerald made a living, right? It's how Hemingway made a living. And the stories of the great American writers of that time, Edith Wharton was writing short stories, and they were all writing short stories, and the short stories were being consumed across the country, and in these national magazines with great fanfare, and they were paid very well for it too. And in that moment, one of the things that provided is that influenced a lot of the way that we read in the second half of the 20th century. Is it allowed wherever you were in the country to hear the Southern voice, to hear the Midwestern voice, the California, LA, the inner city, the African American out of Harlem, let's say, or the short story, which never has to be an expression of the personal experience of the author, but nonetheless were regional realities, where the authors were celebrating or investigating the local language, the local socioeconomic situations, ultimately the local thematics, and self-aware to some degree of, I am writing, Flannery O'Connor is very self-aware. I'm writing about the South. She knows that means something. She knows that the writing that was being done, out of the Northeast at that time was different. And, just as Faulkner knew that. And I think, if we look at it sort of just, again, take a step back, the short story provides that kind of dynamic even now, right? It's that we can say, all right, well, this is a collection of 20 stories, 18 of which are from America, or actually there's less than 18 are from America because there's several from England. Is that right, Jenny? Do we have that?
And Ireland.
And Ireland. So, but let's say whatever it is, 15 from America, and then 3 from in English, but in other countries, and then you have the 2 in translation. The 15 from America, we could break those down even further. So I think, Jenny, I think you're going back to your question. Does the Italian, story sound different than the American? Yes, it does. But in a way that some of the American stories sound different than each other. And that general sort of kaleidoscopic quality, I think, is part of what's terrific about an anthology like this, is where you can hear these sort of different voices and different sort of experiences, and sort of as a single reader. And it creates a very refreshing process, very different from, say, reading a single writer's collection of short stories, which has its own virtues, of course, but where you're getting into an understanding of that author's tone, that author's themes, the world that author likes to investigate. Here you really are moving quickly and fleetly, through the human experience.
And Yvette, I love what Amor did with this edition, which is, I don't know if you had a chance to see in his, actually, it's not until the afterword that we say that you did this.
Yeah, that's right.
But he built the chronology of the stories so that you started with coming of age stories, which is something that I see so many of, and so many of them that are not quite good enough are like, I. And I feel like I don't have that much. I'm impatient with what I have to learn from that right now at this point in my life. But he picked these ones that are just like searingly good. One by Kate DiCamillo, who's known mostly as a children's book writer, right? Winn-Dixie, and coming of age stories that are so beautifully done that they actually transport you to your own childhood, to that intensity of childhood. And then he moves on to young adulthood and stories that are about the love that you meet or the love that falls apart, and then parenthood, and as he says, each phase of life with the attendant issues of each phase of life. And then what's remarkable about this book, I think, is that when he gets to the end and then he does it again. And so I hope I'm not stealing your thunder, Amor.
That's all right. There are 20 stories. And so the way it's organized, and it's not important that the reader know this up front, but the first 10 stories take you from childhood to old age. And each step of the way, kind of the stories are dealing with, not perfectly, but generally sort of moving through the calendar of our life. So a story dealing with youth, and a story then moving, of a child, but then dating or whatever it is, or difficult of adolescence, but then marriage, and then parenthood, and then, the experience of being old and or retired, or, after the children are gone, or whatever the various. But the first 10 kind of follow a trajectory like that. And the 11th story goes back to childhood, and you do it again. So, and I think what I like to think is that if a reader never knew that they would subconsciously sort of have this feeling of going through the human experience from all these different angles. People who've lived different lives than you have as a reader, different gender than you, different race than you, and different part of the country than you, different socioeconomic background than you, but you're going through the shared dynamics of aging. And then it starts again, as I say, in the 11th story, you do it again. I feel like on the subconscious level, they're hopefully sort of this feeling like, is this eternal circle? Is that if there was a 21st story, what it would be. It would be back at childhood again, and we go through this process on and on and on and on.
I love this as an organizing principle. I think sometimes the Bildungsroman gets a little bit of a bad rap, except that they are stories for our whole lives that we have actually read, enjoyed, and gotten so much out of, and it's like, oh, here's another, coming of age story, but done well. I mean, there's just almost nothing like it. But I love this idea of this organizing principle that it's not. I like to read the best stories of each year, um, every year from start to finish. I don't skip around. I don't. So I really appreciate this as a structure for the book. I think it's fantastic. But I'm glad you mentioned the soccer balls of Mr. Kurz and My Good Friend. I wish we could just sort of just read out the table of contents. But people will get to that. People will find the book and they can see it for themselves. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the stories you're excited about, and you can't choose one of your children as your favorite, but um, talk about maybe, or just the collection as a whole. Maybe not just one, but tell us what we're in for. Tell readers what they're in for.
I leave that to you, Jenny.
Oh, well, I'll start. I'll start and just say that the most fun that of this job for me is working with the guest editors, and it's challenging because I wrote it down, but I won't redo the whole thing of all the criteria that Amor gave me for selecting for what he loves in short fiction and what he looks for in fiction. So far, this is my fourth year, and every book has been so completely different. And I would say that this one really has captured Amor's sensibility. I work with some graduate school students. I work with Chioma Eziamo, who actually won a O. Henry herself, and some kids who are in college. But my main assistant is my mother, who is actually, she's like the right price. And she is the best reader that I know. And when she heard that Amor Towles, who we've both read, right? I mean, everyone who's listening to this has read all of his novels and now his stories, and she was so excited. But Amor, the funny thing is that she seemed to think she knew exactly what you were going to like. And from having read your work, which I wasn't as sure about. And so like if a story came along that maybe had some like raunchy sex in it, or that was just gratuitous, but it was in there to shock, but it was doing other interesting things, or if the writing didn't quite soar, my mother would say, we cannot send this to Amor. And so we did, we didn't for the most part, but a few slipped in. And I have to say she was right, Amor. She pretty much had a sense of what you were going to love. And I think it was the things you said at the start, right? I mean, just reading your own stories now, I noticed, wait, let me read one thing. One of the things you said was a side-eyed look on the contemporary world. And I noticed that in your own stories in Table for Two, like it's often the husband or the wife of the main character who's telling the story, giving a side-eyed view. And then he said, freewheeling experimentation, inventive intimacy of prose, shadows of emotional lives, beautiful humane portrayals, idiosyncratic prose. I think you chose stories that had all of these and more, and also stories that had very sharp images, as you were saying with Raymond Carver's Cathedral. If you wanted to put, sort of tell people about that. I keep thinking about your own story, Hasta Luego from Table for Two. Not that I'm trying to sell the wrong book here, but I keep picturing myself like I've missed my plane. I'm trying to get on to the next one. A total stranger asks me to get her husband to his plane, and I'll miss mine. Would I do that? And I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but now having read those stories, I want to be. So I think each story can come with a message, and I think a lot of the stories you picked do have a strong moral compass.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. Now, Jen, that list that you're reading, I guess that's from my email to you, right? That's not in the afterword, is it?
No, that's not anywhere.
That's why I'll just say for
Purely that.
yeah, I think it's important to say for the listener that I hope this is true at any rate, but is that when Jenny reaches out, she'll say, can you give us a sense of what it is that you like in short fiction, and so that we have some sense of because you're not trying to work against each other, obviously, and the purpose of my email to Jenny and the list that she was rattling off, very quickly there, if you saw it and read it, I hopefully what would stand out is that it was trying to make it clear to Jenny and her team that I do not have a preference for something specific, because I don't want this, the conversation of saying, oh, yeah, these sound like a story that Amor would like, which I'm sure is true, and it should have that feel, but that it will make you worry that all the stories sound like my stories or sound like the same story. What I really gave Jenny was sort of this, pointing out that, listen, I love Carver and Updike, but I love Borges, and I grew up reading Ray Bradbury science fiction, and I love the comic short stories of Gogol, and I love. So it was sort of to say I love it all, and I love the ones that are experimental and inventive, and I love the ones that are intimate and heartbreaking, and I love the ones that are spare in their language, and the ones that are elaborate in their language, and that's part of the joy of the short story for me, is that it's a chance to see and hear all these different components. And I said that, yeah, I've been writing short fiction since I was a kid. I think many novelists have written short fiction as a part of their past, because the short story is such a great format for mastering craft. As a writer, if you want to explore different ways of approaching the poetics of language, different ways of approaching point of view, or different ways of writing in tempo, you don't want to run that experiment by writing 5 novels that are different, because that would take you 30 years, and you wouldn't be good at it each time, the first time. So instead you use short stories to try different things out in these areas and refine them. And then you either choose to write novels or short stories or both, but you use the short story, the brevity of it, as an opportunity to explore different approaches to storytelling. And so for me, that, my appetite runs in that direction. And I was very happy with the group of stories that I received. I can't remember, Jenny, I know your team reads like 1,000 stories or something like that. And then, I think it's about 100, and, with the intention of choosing 20. Anybody in a selecting process, you're going to have sort of a yes pile, a maybe pile, a no pile. And as you move forward, your dread is getting to the end and having, 50 in the no pile, 40 in the maybe pile, and 10 in the yes pile.
Mm-hmm.
And realizing that you're going to have to find 10 yeses within the maybes. That's what you dread. And that was not the case here. There were more yeses than I needed. And then it's really start to have a question of, okay, what's going to work well here together? Are these two stories too similar? Is this story really going out on a limb? Let's incorporate that into this mix, and what have you. And I should point out too that I excluded the names from the stories. I excluded the publications they'd been in from the stories. So I really just read the stories on their own. I didn't know, where they'd been published or who had written them. I didn't know the gender or race or whatever of the underlying author. And at the end, this is a funny thing. I remember I had made my choices, and then I began to build a spreadsheet where I had to go back and find the names and and the publishing houses. And then my fear was, oh, great, we're going to end up with, what if it turns out that it's, 16 women or 16 men, whether that's, 10 things from the New Yorker, and that was my big fear, but it ended up being sort of a naturally the diversity of randomness, about equally distributed in terms of men and women. And as we said, a good geographic diversity.
Well, that's right. Because you couldn't, when you're saying they're not like your style, absolutely. There's a Mexican American story, in addition to the translations, Mexican American story about Mexicans coming up to California. And it's like almost like Grapes of Wrath, in a short story with Mexican Americans coming to California, right? And then there's Korean Americans in Hiding Spot, Mexican Americans in Ceranos by Francisco Gonzalez, Indian Americans in Jay Chakrabarty's The Import. There's a story about a girl who isn't comfortable in her own skin, but is getting to be there thanks to her very, very unusual uncle. And Emma Binder, the writer of that, Amor, we snuck in two by Emma Binder, Roy, which is what you chose, and then one called Robbers Lake that had been in the Kenyon Review. And I'm just so happy that you picked one by Emma, because I think they're going to be very, very important writer.
Well, as I say, it's a terrific collection, and I don't say that to my credit. I say that really to the credit of the writers.
It sounds like such an involved process to start from over 1,000 and to winnow it down to this number. And there's also the X factor of Jenny's mom.
Yeah, I was going to say she should edit the next collection, by the way.
I just love knowing this.
Oh, she's the best. And since my dad passed away, it's given us something to talk about,
Wow.
talk about the stories all the time.
How beautiful. Look at the alchemy. It's just bound to happen that you have this number of stories. And I'm hearing what you're saying, that they're not all going to be stories that would read like they're very Amor Towles-esque, sorts of stories.
No.
Because we read so widely, and we appreciate that diversity and the different themes and the different subjects, and it's just bound to happen that way. There's a short story theorist out there named Charles E. May. He's retired, but he used to write about the short story all the time, and I used to follow his blog. And he always wrote about, as others have written about, the ways that the short story says the unsayable. The short story says the unsayable. And I was thinking about that as you all were talking about this idea of what a human experience it is, not just to grapple with loss, not just to live with mystery and unanswered questions, but also to be a very good communicator who cannot always articulate things in their life. And short stories can do that for us. And that's something, again, that the stories in this collection have in common in all these diverse ways, representing all these diverse groups. And I just think that there's such a beauty in that. So just that idea to me, again, is just to celebrate the short story through this series and this particular book in 2024 in our world today. I just think it's something amazing. I cannot wait for people to be able to read this collection of stories. Jenny, Minton Quigley, thank you. And thank you, Amor Towles. Thank you so much.
Yvette, I hope I'll see you in San Antonio.
Jenny Minton Quigley is the editor of the Best Short Stories 2024, a collection of O. Henry Prize-winning stories. She's the author of the memoir, The Early Birds, and editor of the anthology, Lolita in the Afterlife. Amor Towles is the guest editor of the Best Short Stories 2024, a collection of O. Henry Prize-winning stories. He's also the author of Table for Two, The Lincoln Highway, A Gentleman in Moscow, and Rules of Civility. His novels have sold millions and have been translated to more than 30 languages. This has been Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.